All right, so welcome again, everyone, to the competency-based fieldwork evaluation orientation session, gearing up for basic fieldwork. Before I get started, I would like to acknowledge that the University of Manitoba campuses are located on Treaty 1 territory, on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Red River Valley Métis. As a white settler woman, I do respect the treaties and the assumptions under which Indigenous peoples entered into these treaties. And I acknowledge the harms done to Indigenous peoples who have cared for this land over the years. And I'm working to understand the history and ongoing impact of colonization and my role and responsibilities in these ongoing harms. In the context of our session today and fieldwork overall, I do acknowledge that fieldwork within the MOT program directly impacts Indigenous communities. And I'm committed to remaining humble and open and to working in meaningful collaboration with Indigenous communities and using a strengths-based approach in order for us to move forward in the best way possible so that we can really work towards fostering equitable, safe, and inclusive fieldwork learning opportunities for Indigenous peoples, and also to promote opportunities for Indigenous fieldwork education within our program. We are making small gains. We have a long way to go. Before we dive into the CBFE, I am going to provide a brief overview of the MOT curriculum to help provide some context for where your students are at. And I am really pleased to say that we are now in a place where we are back to our regular curriculum after having a couple of years of reconfiguration related to COVID and also related to the UN labor action. So here is our typical curriculum schedule for our students. So the first year students that are coming your way for basic fieldwork have just entered the program in August, and they've finished a fall term of academic courses, and they will be then heading into basic fieldwork for 4 weeks. Then when they come back, once they're done fieldwork, they'll have a break over the holidays. They'll come back in January and finish another stretch of academics, and then they'll go into intermediate 1 fieldwork in May, June. And then you can see their progression in year 2, where eventually they'll complete their 3rd fieldwork placement, intermediate 2. And then at the very end of the program, they'll complete their final advanced fieldwork placement, which is their transition to practice placement. So that's how our program looks. Right now, our students are working really hard in the classroom, and they are really eager and excited to get out into the field and to see each of you. So this slide here depicts one way that we view professional development for our U of M students. What I would really like you to see from this slide is how our students develop across the 4 placements. So if we think about this as the continuum of being an entry-level student into the program, all the way until an entry-level practicing clinician, students coming into basic fieldwork are really at this beginning exposure level. So this is where our students are sitting at basic fieldwork. The term exposure definitely reflects a part of basic, but something that's important to know is that it's not meant to be all exposure or all a watch placement. Once your student is grounded and settled and well-orientated and they've had a chance to see you do things a few times, we really want your student to become active, taking on or assisting you or working with part of your caseload. Then in the middle stage here, we have the acquisition stage. This would comprise our intermediate placements. So our intermediate 1 and our intermediate 2 placements. They're typically longer, they're 8 weeks long for each of them. And that's where students gain much more practice and experience with their assessment skills, with intervention skills, with really consolidating their reasoning and their problem solving, and getting ready to move to this integration phase, which is the final transition to practice phase, moving into, that would be their advanced fieldwork, their final placement. This table provides us with another way of looking at the different fieldwork placements. What I'd really like to highlight for you here is the levels, because these levels coincide with the levels on the competency-based fieldwork evaluation. So level 1 on the CBFE is basic fieldwork. Level 2 would be intermediate 1 or intermediate 2 fieldwork. And then level 3 is advanced fieldwork. So when you are evaluating your student in basic fieldwork, you're evaluating them at the level 1 stage. The style of supervision is very much direct and active at this stage. It's a very much more structured type of placement, and your role as a fieldwork educator really has that teacher-educator flavor. And then as your students move on to other placement levels, you'll see your style of supervision and your role start to change and evolve. So in intermediate, you'll be working much more collaboratively with your student. And then towards advanced, you'll be working towards that more consultative and mentorship style role. As we all know with anything, it's not 100% linear. So students and yourselves as educators will find yourselves going back and forth a bit, but this just provides an overall overview of how students progress throughout these different stages and levels. So that's a quick overview of our program and how we're structured. Now, how about the CBFE? So the CBFE was developed a number of years ago out of Western University. And here at U of M, we just started to roll it out in the fall of 2019. So by now, many of us are familiar with it, but there's a number of educators that are still becoming familiar with it. And we're still, as a university, also becoming just familiar with how it works and how people are responding to it. Just letting one person in here. There we go. So it is now used in all but one of the English-speaking OT programs in Canada. It's also used internationally in Ireland, for example. It has been mapped successfully to the profile of practice and to the essential competencies. And I'll speak a bit more to that later in terms of our new competencies for OTs in Canada. It's also a copyrighted eval, which has some implications for how we share that with you, and I'll speak to that again later as well. So what about the new competencies for OTs in Canada? So again, the CBFE has been mapped to the essential competencies, and now we are in a position nationally where all of the programs and the coordinators with the programs are reviewing the CBFE, and it is in the process of being redeveloped. And the expectation is that it will then align more with the new core competencies for OTs in Canada. And also will, as with any evaluation, they'll be working on some improvements to just improve the overall usability and meaningfulness of the form. So that is going to be a project that I would expect nothing will really come to fruition for another minimum 2 to 3 years, but just wanted to make you aware of that. Following the rollout, there was a study showing that the CBFE really did typically measure students being ready to transition to practice at the end of their final placement. And it really showed that minimum of 1,000 hours of field work related well to students being ready to practice. There's also good evidence with the current CBFE. It was field and pilot tested, and it did show good face validity, and again was seen to accurately reflect students' development across the placements. These links here provide you with some resources for additional information. Some people find it helpful. It goes a little bit more over the creation and implementation of the CBFE. Just a caution that every university implements the CBFE in a slightly different way, so you just want to be aware of that as you're watching these videos, if you choose to. I'd like to highlight some of the nuances in terms of accessing the evaluation and the expectations of you as an educator. So once again, it is a copyright form. We have purchased books that each site can have access to if you want, the manual. If you don't have one on site, just let us know and we can mail one out to you. And every student also must purchase a copy of this manual. And that then allows us to share an electronic version of with you as the educators. So that's how we manage the copyright agreement with the publisher. You as an educator are completing this at midterm and final, but you're not expected to indicate if the placement's a pass or fail. When we were working with the publisher, we weren't able to get rid of the one tick box on the form that says, do you recommend the student pass the placement? Yes or no. You're welcome to tick that box off, but it's not a requirement. Ooh, I apologize. I just advanced this way too much. So the manual itself, for those of you who do have a copy of it on site or who eventually would like to get a copy, is actually relatively small. The first section is really comprises talking about the history and the evidence and the scoring. And then within the manual, there's also 2 paper copies of the evaluation. The evaluation is essentially made up of 7 competencies. And then for each competency, there's a corresponding learning objective page where students develop their own personal learning objectives. And then there's a final overall score that really is meant to be a synthesis of your overall evaluation of where you think your students at in their development. Are there any questions so far before I go on? So to review again, the CBFE is comprised of these 7 competencies. For each competency, there's also an opportunity for your student to develop their own personal learning objectives, or what we sometimes call their learning plan. And then the form also has some demographic information at the very beginning, which is very similar to our old evaluation. So what are these competencies? So you'll see here depicted on the slide the 7 key competencies that the CBFE evaluates. The first one being practice knowledge, which really is capturing your students' sort of OT-specific theory and knowledge. The second competency is linked to clinical reasoning and really focuses on your students' abilities related to their analytical and conceptual thinking, their judgment, their decision-making, their problem-solving. That's all encompassed under clinical reasoning. The third competency, facilitating change within a practice process, really speaks to the OT process that your students starting to develop their abilities in. So right from the moment of receiving the referral all the way through developing the relationship with your client or clients, assessment, intervention, discharge, and follow-up. The fourth competency, professional interactions, is very much reflecting all of the relationships that your students developing with your clients, their development of relationships with colleagues, and then also it looks at upholding those professional and ethical standards. Communication encompasses both the written and the verbal communication. Professional development really captures your students, really captures where your students at in terms of being able to look at time and resource management and setting priorities, as well as developing their leadership ability. And I think I skipped professional development. So I just spoke to performance management, which is about time and resources, and professional development is really looking at your students' ability to self-reflect and identify where their strengths and weaknesses are and be self-directed and really accountable for their own learning and their own development. So that really encompasses the structure of the evaluation. We know that for each and the competencies that are involved. For each competency, there's 2 parts. There's the educator's expectations with the competency rating scale, and then there's the student's learning objective and the learning objective rating scale that goes with that. So before I go any further, I'd like to share the form and take you for a tour of the form, just so it'll help you to give a framework for what we're talking about here. So I'm going to now bring up that form. Is everyone able to see the form? I just need one or two thumbs up. Yes, excellent. Thanks, Julia. So here we have a copy, an electronic version of the competency-based fieldwork evaluation. You'll see the first few pages here are very much, again, they're very much demographic. They're filling out the student's information, the level of the placement, and some description of the placement. That's really important for us so that we can track and record the nature of the placement that the student's in, and over time we can see how their profile develops. So that's the first few pages. You'll see here there are some signatures here at midterm and final. And my warning to you now is to not sign the form until the placement is done at the very end of the placement. The reason being is that this form can be a little bit fickle. And if you sign the form, there's a chance that you'll no longer be able to go back in and edit, that it'll lock the form. So we just want to advise everyone to save your signature for the very last thing you do before you say goodbye to your student. So after that demographic and face sheet information, then we get into the competencies. So this first page here represents the competency number 1, practice knowledge. So you'll see underneath practice knowledge, there are some bullets which really give you some insight into that competency practice knowledge. All of these bullets here are what we call the competency descriptors. Again, they're giving some insight into the practice knowledge competency. And these competency descriptors are outlined for each competency. And then over to the right, you'll see the stages and the scoring table. So you'll see those levels that I was referring to before, level 1, level 2, level 3, and you'll see the legend for scoring for each level. So again, for basic field work, we're looking in this level 1 between 1 to 3. And then as we go through on the competency page, you'll see the competency rating scale. So this scale really reflects your student's development from that of an entry-level student all the way until an entry-level clinician when they essentially graduate and move into practice. So what happens is at midterm and at final, you'll rate your student based on your expectations using this drop-down arrow. So you may, at midterm, rate your student at a 2 if you felt they were on track for meeting your expectations by final. And then you may rate them at a 3. For example, if you were feeling quite comfortable that they're clearly meeting all of your expectations at the end of the placement. And we'll talk more about grading in a few minutes. This is just to give you a sense of the form. Then you have the opportunity to write comments at midterm and at final. And here's where you'll sort of reflect very briefly what your student's doing well, and also comment on some examples for opportunities for growth where you'd like to see them improve or work on in the final stretch of the placement. One thing to note is that we understand basic is a short 4-week placement. So your opportunity to provide feedback and comments is going to be relative to that short time. So it doesn't have to be a very lengthy comment section, but those sentences that just briefly capture what your student's doing well and where they need to improve are really, really helpful. So that's the competency rating scale for the practice knowledge competency. And then so we have a page dedicated to that. Also for each competency, you'll see the student learning objective page. So here's the student learning objective page for that corresponding competency practice knowledge. Here's where your student will be filling in their information for their personal learning objective. And then at the bottom of the page is the learning objective rating scale, where you'll be rating your student, as will they in their self-evaluation, where you think their progress is on their personal learning objectives. So at midterm, you sort of hover over the dot and wait for that little hand to appear. And you can sort of mark there where you feel your student's at midterm. Oops, sorry, I did the final there. Just let go of that. You can delete it just by clicking on it again. So there's the midterm rating, and then potentially at final, here's where you would be able to rate them their progress on their personal learning objective at final. We'll get into learning objectives more a little later. Something to keep in mind is that your students' personal learning objectives are not part of the overall pass-fail decision. Students can, in fact, take a personal learning objective and carry that forward into another placement. So there's not an expectation necessarily that they meet that objective entirely within your placement. And something else to keep in mind is that for basic, your student only needs to develop 3 personal learning objectives. You're still rating them on all the 7 competencies, but they only need to develop 3 personal learning objectives overall. So they will only have filled out a personal learning objective for 3 of those 7 competencies, for 3 total. So moving on, again, this whole pattern of the competency rating scale and the learning objective rating scale repeats itself for each competency. So for each competency, there's the competency rating scale with comments, and then the corresponding learning objective rating scale. So here we'll see the competency for clinical reasoning, and then we'll see the corresponding learning objective page. And then that pattern really repeats itself all the way for all 7 competencies. So I'm going to just scroll to the end here. Here's that final competency number 7, performance management. And then after you've rated all the 7 competencies, there's an opportunity for you to provide an overall rating of your students' performance. So that is here under item number 8. You would provide that rating at midterm and at final, and also provide some comments as well as some directions for future learning once the placement's over. This particular rating is not so much an average as it is your overall synthesis of where you feel your students at in their development. It, again, is not included in the overall determination of pass or fail. The determination of pass or fail is really based on the final marks for the 7 competencies. You'll see at the end, again, there's this recommendation to pass the placement. You're welcome to fill that out, but you're not obligated. And then there's also the signature lines, which you want to hold off until the very end of the placement. So that is a brief tour of the form. All of you by now should have received an electronic copy, and if you haven't, please let me know. Your student also receives a copy of this form, and their version of the form is exactly as yours. The only difference is they have a learning log at the very end, which helps them track their learning experiences throughout the placement. So they also do a self-evaluation of their performance at midterm and final using the same form that you do. Before I move away from this form, are there any questions about the form? Just checking here. Okay, I don't see any questions, so I'm going to carry on. I'm going to put us back to our slides. Can everyone see my full slide again? I'm hoping so. I just need 1 thumbs up to make sure. Thanks, Louise. Okay. So we've covered the history and the overview of the key components, and now you have a sense of the form. I'd like to move us in now to talking about expectations and the competency rating scale. This is what's going to be really key for you when it comes to actually providing that rating on the scale. So how do you set your placement expectations, and what are you measuring against when it comes to doing your evaluation with your student? The CBFE is really based on the placement expectations that you are setting as an educator. So there's a number of things that you're going to pull together to help you determine and set your placement expectations that you'll use to evaluate your student. The first being those competency descriptors, so those bullet point summaries that are under each competency on the form. The second key thing you're going to use to help create your placement expectations are the learning outcomes for the level of placement. So in this case, for basic fieldwork, each of you will have received the basic fieldwork course learning outcomes, and those identify the learning outcomes for basic fieldwork. Those outcomes will evolve and morph over time for each placement level, but right now you're just focusing on the basic fieldwork outcomes. It's really important to keep in mind that we very much appreciate that you're the expert of your practice setting and the opportunities that are available. So another key part of developing your expectations is thinking about your own knowledge of your placement and what are the learning opportunities that your students going to have the opportunity to observe you do, and then to gain some practice in so that you can fairly evaluate them. So you're thinking about your knowledge of the placement and the OT role. You're thinking about the learning outcomes for basic fieldwork. And you're also thinking about those competency descriptors, what that competency is about. The other key piece that I think will be very helpful for you as you think about setting your placement expectations is the mapping worksheet that we've shared for you. So this document, we fondly refer to it as our CBFE mapping worksheet for basic fieldwork. And I'm hoping that some of you, most of you should have received it. You may not have had a chance to go through it yet though. But it's essentially a table that we've developed or we've created to help you develop your placement expectations. So in that table, you'll see the first column outlines the competency and describes what it is. And then we've mapped that competency to the relevant learning outcome for basic fieldwork. And then we've provided an example of what might be a reasonable expectation in basic for that competency. And then in the final column, we have it's a blank column, and that's where you can then think about your unique practice setting and write down the expectations, or 2 or 3, whatever it might be for that particular competency. So if you haven't had a chance to look at that worksheet, or if you for some reason have not received it, I would really suggest looking at it. It seems to be a helpful way for educators to link their expectations to the CBFE. And the examples provided should help you to think about what might be a reasonable expectation for basic related to that competency. And then ultimately, by setting those expectations, it gives you a roadmap for what you're evaluating your student against when it comes time to completing the CBFE. Any questions about that so far? Okay. So in summary, you're going to use a number of things to help you set your placement expectations. You're thinking about the learning opportunities in your environment. You're also thinking about, you could potentially look at the Fieldwork site profile and what opportunities you've identified there as well. You're thinking about the basic fieldwork learning outcomes. You're using also that mapping worksheet to help you develop those expectations. And also just keeping in mind that you're setting minimum placement expectations. Even in the worksheet, those expectations are minimum placement expectations for where you would envision your student to be by the end of basic. So you're really asking yourself, what do you minimally expect for your student to do or to show on a regular basis in order to say, yes, they've achieved your minimum expectation for that competency by the end of the placement. And then they're ready to move on to intermediate 1. By having those minimum placement expectations, I can't reinforce how important that is, because it really gives you the roadmap and your student, and provides that structure for when you go to provide and do the rating scale. You know exactly kind of what you're measuring against and where your students at along the way. So when it comes time for the midterm and final evaluation on the competency rating scale, you're rating your student based on your placement expectations that you've developed, and you're placing that rating on the competency scale and providing comments. Here's an example in a paper version of what this might look like for the communication competency. So here you can see the student at midterm was in this case, a 2 would be reflecting that they were on track for meeting your expectations at final. A 3 would indicate that they've clearly met your expectations at final. And then there's some comments that reflect where the student's at. So what do we expect on the rating scale? I'll speak a bit more about our levels of expectations related to the rating scale. So if we think about level 1, basic fieldwork, typically 3 would equate with mastery of that level and being ready to transition to level 2. For our level 2 placements, which are intermediate 1 and intermediate 2, we see 6 as being mastery of that level and ready to move on to level 3. Because we have 2 intermediate placements within level 2, we've delineated intermediate 1 as level 2A with a maximum of 5, and intermediate 2 as level 2B with a maximum rating of 6. So a rating of 6 at intermediate 2 would be a very clear indicator that your student's ready to move on to level 3 advanced fieldwork. And then when your student gets to advanced, if you do have an advanced placement eventually, typically 8 would be clearly reflective of your student being ready to transition to practice. One thing that's important to recognize is that the decision for a pass or fail is not solely up to you. Once all the marks come in, that decision would rest here at the university. And I'm looking at the competency ratings at final. The overall determination of pass or fail is based on those 7 competency ratings at final. The midterm evaluation marks are very important, but they aren't included in the overall decision of pass or fail. Oh, sorry. This slide provides a sort of an overview summary of grading for each of the placement levels. We'll take a closer look at basic fieldwork. So here we have a description of the competency ratings at final. So keep in mind, this would be at final. So clearly, if there were concerns around professionalism and ethics and safety, your student, a U would really indicate that the performance was unacceptable. And in this case, we would have had a lot of conversation before it even got to that point. By rating your student at a 1 at final, that would reflect that your student's experiencing quite a bit of difficulty meeting basic level 1 expectations for that competency. A score of 2 would indicate that your student's nearly meeting basic level 1 expectations for that competency. And a score of 3 would indicate that your student's clearly meeting basic level 1 expectations. And 3 is the maximum for basic. So we ask that you don't rate your student higher than a 3 for the basic placement. If at the final evaluation, the average of the 7 competency scores is 2 or above, that means your student would probably pass. Between 1.6 and 1.99, they would be flagged for review. And that really means once a student's flagged for review, that I no longer would be assigning a pass or fail. I would be having more conversation with you and more conversation with the student so that I could bring all that information together and take it to our faculty progress meeting. And that's where a decision would be made regarding the student's progression and whether or not they were assigned a pass or fail for that placement. We recognize that it's not an expectation that your student would achieve a 3 in all competencies. And so that's why the overall average doesn't need to be a 3 in order to pass the placement. There can still be some variation in the competencies by the end. So before we move into learning objectives, I'm going to just check and see if there's any questions regarding the grading of the competencies. Don't see anything. Okay, please feel free to speak up as I move along. So we've really covered those expectations related to the competencies. And now I'm going to move us into the student learning objectives. So the student learning objectives, or their personal learning objectives, are really much more within your students' control. It's about the learning that they sort of identify for themselves as being Really important, over and above the placement expectations that you've set. So the learning objectives for your student that they are developing are developed by the end of the first week of the placement. And we say by the end because we appreciate that your student needs some time to be immersed in the practice setting and to be able to get a sense of what might be a reasonable learning objective to work on. So the goal is that they develop their learning objectives by the end of the first week. They're meant to be done in collaboration with you, but really your role is to help ensure that that personal learning objective they've identified is in fact doable and realistic in your setting. And sometimes students in basic, they do need a little bit more help to develop their personal learning objectives. It's important to realize that the personal learning objectives that your student sets are meant to be additional or augmentative to your standard placement expectations as much as possible. They're not meant to be sort of an exact repeat of your expectations, but more so something that the student identifies that they'd like to learn more about or know, that's very relevant for their personal learning. For your basic fieldwork student that's coming your way, we only ask that they develop 3 personal learning objectives across all the competencies. In theory, they could develop 3 for one competency, but most typically what we see is they'll choose 3 competencies and develop 1 personal learning objective for those 3 competencies for a total of 3 personal learning objectives. Once our students get into intermediate and advanced, then they're asked to develop a minimum of 1 for each competency. So the learning objectives that your student develops at basic, those 3 learning objectives, they're rated by the student at midterm and final, and they're also rated by you at midterm and final. So the challenge is to ensure that you are able to get your students' learning objective information copied into your version of the evaluation. So often educators will have your students just copy and paste their learning objectives into your version of the evaluation. That way, when you go to rate their progress on the learning objective rating scale, you have that context right there on the page to do it. A note here again that learning objectives, those learning objectives your student develops do not determine pass or fail. They're not part of that overall rating. This slide, just the top part here, really speaks to some key sort of summary points that the learning objectives are not numerical. They do not determine pass or fail. Students can in fact carry them over into another placement. What they need to do is clearly identify their objective. Then they need to think about what resources they need in order to achieve that objective. They also need to think about the evidence. So what proof will they have of how they're going to meet that learning objective? And then they need to think about how they want it to be validated. So for example, they may look to you for feedback regarding that objective, or maybe another team member, or they may use some form of self-reflection or a journal to help validate that particular objective that they're working on. When they're thinking about what it is that they're going to be working on, they need to complete all these 4 columns on that learning objective page. So their objective, the resources that are required, the evidence, the proof for how they'll show that they've met it, and how they want it to be validated. And again, they're going to work to copy that information into your version of the evaluation so that when you go to rate it, you've got that context. So we've covered the main pieces of the evaluation now. We've gone over the competencies and the rating scale and how you go about setting your expectations, and then the learning objectives, which are very much more within your students' control. I'm going to wrap up by just talking about the process of the evaluation and what that looks like when you have your student with you. But before I do, are there any questions? Does anyone have any questions before I move on? I'm going to assume we're fine, so I'll keep going. In terms of the process, first of all, just thinking about expectations. By the end of the first week, the expectations of your student are that they're going to develop in basic 3 personal learning objectives. The other expectation of your student is at midterm and final, they are going to rate themselves on all 7 competencies, as well as their 3 personal learning objectives. And they're going to share that with you at your midterm and final meeting. And then they're also going to complete their fieldwork experience evaluation form and share that with you at midterm and final. So those are the expectations of your student. In terms of your expectations of an educator, you're going to be setting your minimum expectations for the competencies, where you want your student to be at by the end of the basic fieldwork placement. You'll collaborate with your student to develop their personal learning objectives. Most of the responsibilities on your student, but you're there to really help tweak and ensure it's realistic and doable. And then at midterm and final, you are grading and providing comments on all 7 competencies and for those 3 personal learning objectives that your student's creating. The whole process of midterm is very similar to how it was with the old evaluation. You really want to have a chance to sit down and have a conversation with your student, for your student to share their self-evaluation, for you to share yours, and for also your student to share their evaluation of the fieldwork experience. Just to remind, I'll back up just to say regarding the midterm and final evaluation meetings, sometimes it's helpful to share your evaluations with each other in advance so you can both take some time to digest it before you actually have your formal midterm and final meeting. It's also really helpful if your student can be given a copy of their midterm evaluation sort of just after it's happened, so they can take some time to digest it and think about how they're going to use that to work towards the final 2 weeks of the placement. Just a reminder, again, you're not expected to indicate if the placement's a pass or fail, but you are welcome to do so. And then in terms of sending the forms in, there's no expectation to send anything at midterm. It's just at final. So once the final is completed, that's when you'll send all 3 forms to OT Fieldwork email. So you'll send your student self-evaluation, you'll send your version of the CBFE, and you'll send the copy of the fieldwork experience evaluation form. So all those 3 forms. A note about the copyright aspect. So as I mentioned earlier, the CBFE is a copyright evaluation. Now, because the students purchased a manual, we can now share it with you electronically. But then once the placement is over, we ask that once everything's downloaded and we've received your evaluations, you'll get an email from Rhonda saying everything's in good order, and she'll just ask you to then delete it from your system. So you're deleting it because it's a copyright evaluation, but also just in terms of confidentiality of student information. I'm going to close before questions with some tips and tricks, just to let you know that when we started rolling out the CBFE in 2019, we worked really hard with the publisher to make the electronic version of the form as user-friendly as possible. But there are still some kinks and growing pains that we're working on. For the most part, it works really well for people. But sometimes people do find the form can be a little fickle. And so if you're having any trouble with the form, I would suggest emailing us right away, and we will help you troubleshoot and do some problem solving around it. There's a couple things to ensure that you maybe won't have difficulty. One is, for sure, don't sign it to the very end. The second is, when you receive the form, you want to download it and save it in a separate file. Then each time you work in it, you want to use that save as feature. So save it as, version 1, version 2 each time. That strategy seems to be really helpful for ensuring that we don't lose information. And I would encourage you, even that first time you do some documenting in the CBFE, to sort of do a trial run and make sure that your information is saved. The other thing is that sometimes when you're working in the Mac preview mode, the numbers can look different. So they'll look lower, and it gives students a scare. But then when we open it on our end and with the Adobe Acrobat Reader, the numbers look fine. So if you have any issues with the score, transposing and looking odd and giving your student a scare, just let us know. We can check and make sure that we've got the right scores. If at any time you're fighting with the form, again, you want to call us. The other option is you can potentially, if you're someone who likes to do paper and pen, you can have it printed and then just scan, email it to us. That's also another option. But we are here to help you get through it, and we don't want you to struggle with it for more than, for more than a few minutes. We want you to reach out to us, and we will get back to you that same day. I believe we've come right to the end of my part of the information. So I'm going to stop sharing and just see if there's any questions. I see there's one comment in the chat, so I'll just check that. So Jane, I see your comment. There's only one fieldwork educator listed. What if the student has two? So sometimes you can squeeze it into the same line, but also in the comment section, even under directions for future learning, we just ask there that you comment that there was another educator that was involved in the placement facilitation. So as long as it's somewhere on that form that evaluation was completed by two of you. Sometimes it's three, so you can use that last comment box to put that in. Are there any other questions? I hope people are feeling comfortable with the form. Sometimes the questions arise once you start using it. So after today, as you're thinking about having your student come your way, or when you're in the midst of it, please let us know, and we will definitely, we can arrange a phone call or a Zoom call to help walk you through it. If there's no other questions, would like to just say thank you so much for coming today, and just for making the time to learn more about the evaluation, and also just to be welcoming our students in a few weeks to basic fieldwork. We really, really appreciate it. Thanks, everyone. Take care.